Well, there are shared responsibilities for public health is a matter for the Victorian government.
It's a federal responsibility,
the federal government regulates aged care.
But it is fundamentally a federal government responsibility.
We regulate aged care, but when there is a public health pandemic, then public health, whether it gets into aged care, shopping centres, schools or anywhere else, then they are things that marriage from Victoria. So I don't think it's as binary as you suggest.
Yeah, look, Patricia, I went back this week and had a look at 6 months ago, the Prime Minister released the emergency response plan for the coronavirus. You might remember it, he waved it around a lot. In that plan, it says on page 17, the Australian government will be responsible for residential aged care facilities. Now, the PM's no doubt right that the community transmission in Victoria is the underlying problem here, but responsibility for aged care is pretty clear, isn't it?
It's 100% clear. There is no ambiguity at all. The buck stops entirely with the federal government. This idea that because community transmission was going on in Victoria, which it clearly was, that somehow makes it some sort of shared arrangement is the most ludicrous statement I've ever heard. The whole point of having a plan that deals with sort of a spike, a pandemic, an increase in cases, is to deal with the potential of an increase in community transmission, which happened very sadly for anyone living through it in Victoria. The job of the federal government is to entirely try to solve that. What's become crystal clear is that they were not prepared enough. We know they got a report after the Dorothy Henderson incident. We know they were warned. We know they had the material before them, and they look very clearly ill-prepared for it. They need to take full responsibility for it. And this week, we saw an embarrassing performance.
Let's have a look at this. Yeah. It clearly didn't help. This is the Aged Care Minister, Richard Colbeck, appearing before a Senate committee. He's asked how many people have died in aged care as a result of coronavirus.
How many residents of aged care facilities funded and regulated by the Australian government have passed away from COVID-19?
I'll just have to look up my latest report, Chair. That might take me a moment.
Minister, you weren't aware of that number?
I was just trying to find my latest sit rep, Chair. It wasn't in the frontline details of those figures. I have got the details, I just couldn't find it at hand, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we all forget figures from time to time, but that's, a terrible look not to have a better answer, a more compassionate answer at that moment.
David, that was such an embarrassing and hurtful, can I say, for the many families who are victims of this awful virus moment. This is the aged care minister. This is the biggest crisis he'll face in his career. This is not a tricky gotcha question, because I've spoken to coalition people who say, these gotcha moments. This isn't one. I'm sorry, but this is not in the column of gotcha questions. This is a standard question. This is something that you have to know. The number of victims and the number of active cases. Even if you can't recall many facts and figures, I'm terrible at it. I'd be a terrible treasurer. I can never remember facts and figures. You'd have it on your front page. The number of deaths is key.
Even something ballpark. The figure at the time was 258, the officials pointed out. Lani, what did you make of that moment? But also, the Prime Minister's efforts here to, I guess, share the responsibility around.
Yeah, that moment was an absolute debacle. It's 260 people that have died in aged care. That's 260 families around Australia who have lost their loved ones potentially before they needed to. So that was an absolute debacle. The aged care minister should know that number off the top of his head. And I do think that the federal government, it is their responsibility. They do need to take responsibility for it and not farm that out to the states, because as you pointed out, David, in the emergency response plan 6 months ago, the federal government said it was their responsibility.